Hello, and this will mark the beginning of all of the recordings that I intend to do for this series. This series will be a series of episodes that I will be recording for lore of my D&D world. I've been DMing for a while now, a couple of years, and in doing so, a lot of people have asked me of like, hey, is there any way we can record the sort of lore that you're giving the players? Because I was asked the same question multiple times over and over and had to reiterate myself multiple times. And people said to me like, hey, is there any way that you could just record it and I could just listen to that? And then that way there's no reason for you to waste your breath effectively. And with that little slip up comes the very important note of I will be doing all of these in one take, just to have it organic and simple. And we're going to see how that goes and just see how many mistakes I make for this first recording in one roll take. Because I know they are going to happen more than just that one time. So, with the purpose of why I'm recording this, we get to the next point, which is that I will be recording this first episode that I'll be getting to in a second about the story of the four. As you guessed it, it's probably four people that are a party of adventurers that form a lot of the key aspects to a lot of like why there are allegiances of certain factions and countries and kingdoms throughout the world, and also survive to have influence with a lot of the party later down the timeline. Uh, so, in doing that and talking about just the four, it will probably take me a while. So, that is an example of a session that is going to take me a very long time to sit down and just record it. However, there will also be other topics that I will be covering that will be much, much shorter. So, episodes might range from anywhere of an hour. I don't really want to go over that to anywhere to like 10, 15 minutes to answer a simple question. Because I'm also doing these in one take, like I mentioned before, uh, it might also prompt me to come back and revisit a topic with more detailing. So if I go through an entire episode and I have all the narrative that I create and I get to my questions and everything and I answer them, then I might have one that I didn't answer and it's kind of important and I feel I should cover it. So I might release another episode entirely to cover that one question. Uh, in aiding in that sort of like question and response sort of dialogue, I might have guests that will come on as well, and they can help me aid in the sort of organic development of the lore and narrative that I want to deliver through this podcast. Uh, that being said, like I kind of briefly brushed over, I will also be doing every episode as a sort of intro. What is the topic? Why was it asked? Get to the actual narrative of the topic. And then once I finish that, I will get to the frequently asked questions at the very end to keep that sort of conversation dialogue. Most of the time, I will have those timestamps down in the description because I will be uploading this to YouTube. So go ahead and just look in the description and you can skip to any part in there to get to the frequently asked questions if you don't like the other part because you think I'm just lecturing to you, which hopefully that is not what it turns into. So now that I have covered that, let's get to the first topic of what I will be talking about, which is the story of the four. So, the story of the four focuses in on a head archmage, a warrior from simple farmlands and beginnings, a con man from the lowly streets of a city, and a prodigy pyromancer. Those four people will all be known as Peluvia, Therum, Twillick, and Agni, respectively. They'll come to have a lot of influence as they begin to grow in reputation and power. However, they will also begin to fall apart as the story progresses. So, let's focus in on the first character, who is Peluvia. Peluvia is originally from the town of Gehil, which is a coastal city that thrived mainly off of its fishing exports and grew up there as well, under the stewardship of the actual college that was there to teach the arcane magics that he would come to master. At the age of 22, he would actually be promoted to head arcanist. However, he had a lot of subordinate faculty that would actually oversee a lot of the official happenings of the academy, since he wasn't old enough to be able to handle all of those in a mature way all the time. At the age of 22, when he was also an archmage for the first year, he created his first spell as his sort of like heralding project to the knowledge that he would bring to his students. That spell would become known as Peluvius Disc, which is going to be important as we progress through the stories because he will be refining that spell and it will become very notable for certain factions to actually follow people who could cast that spell since it was difficult. So after all of this, you think Peluvia's got a pretty good track record. He's got an archmage status. He's the head of an institution. He's making his own spells. He's doing really well. And that was the case all up until one day while he was preparing to head out on a sort of trip that would take him to most of the other cities to share the arcane knowledge that his institution had with any of the other notable institutions. He was preparing for all of this, and everything was getting ready as the far distance in the evening began to glow with a radiant light. Recognizing this as an incoming impact into the city, they tried to evacuate the city. And as they were, Peluvia, with the assistance of one of his very close faculty, who majorly oversaw the enrollment of students, actually went and escaped. This was mainly because Peluvia was actually shoved into a teleportation circle by the other mage and sent to one of the remote locations outside of the city. After being sent there, Peluvia turned to watch the city that he called home and that he knew as his place of growing up and his place of learning just become shattered. And most of the residents there, almost all of them, were actually killed in the impact as two, what we will call celestial figures, impacted here. We will get to exactly who those two figures are in another episode, as they have a whole tangent of lore involving them, but know that those two figures are known as Hestrel and Dentril. After the impact and the leveling of his city, Luvia went and tried to search for survivors from the academy, trying to scavenge what he could, and in finding some survivors from the impact, mostly people who got out in the initial warning of trying to evacuate the city, he searches for a while and eventually finds the ring that he gave his mother because it was magically enchanted. This ring allowed her to contact him once per day magically. However, after the impact and shattering, the enchantment had been lost. Her body was nowhere to be found, and while he thought that was curious, in a mourning state, he simply took the ring, took what he had ready to leave on his trip to the other academies, and left. On his travels, as he traveled for roughly half a year, he eventually came upon a simple homestead that housed the parents of a single daughter, and their daughter's name was Agni. As Olivia stayed here for a little bit as a respite from travel in the wilderness, he did grow to have conversation with Agni that she was looking to eventually leave the homestead and actually go to the cities in hopes of learning a trade. However, in their conversation, Olivia also found that part of the trade that she was learning, or rather hoping to learn, was that she was hoping to refine her magical abilities. And being an archmage and seeing the potential once she demonstrated it, began the instruction to her of using her abilities, which mostly adapted towards all evocation magics and fire and things like that. So, after discovering this, Peluvia began on his way with Agni at his side. The two parents of Agni were hesitant to let her depart, but were also very apt to let her travel with an archmage to refine her magical abilities, since that was both a free education and also a lifetime opportunity for her. After the two traveled for a couple months across the rest of the open area between the two cities of where Peluvia had gone and rested at the homestead and then was traveling to another city, they came across this open wall to the city that they were intending to arrive at. But before they could even get in, they were stopped by the guard and told them that foreigners were simply not allowed. In this whole discussion of trying to get Agni in to get further instruction because she was nearing the limit of what Peluvia could teach her, there was growing tension as two other figures arrived. These two other figures arrived from the outside of the walls, returning from a supposed hunting trip, as they were Twilik and Theorem. The honorable person that Theorem was saw the honest intent of Agni and Peluvia and tried to offer them a way to get in, while Twilik was more of letting them in to try and keep an eye on them and maybe take their coin purses later. As they traveled through the city for a while to try and get Agni more education, they arrived at the Arcane Institution to find that it was at a near limit that Pluvia was at, and that she would seek no further education from there than she could from Pluvia on the road. So after some deliberation, they decided to leave. Surprisingly, both Theorem and Twilik decided that they were going to accompany the Archmage and his student out into the wilderness, as Theorem had a gut feeling that, while he hated wizards and hated magic in general because he felt it dishonorable, he felt an inkling of honor towards Peluvia's actions and wanted to see and learn more about what an honorable wizard could be. Twilik was more interested in the fame that could come from a very talented group adventuring and trying to see what they could find out in the wilderness, as there were a number of tasks to take care of. After adventuring around, discovering ruins, recording new locations that they found, linking cities together through communication of word and things like that, they eventually became known for what they had been doing, known as the Four. And after becoming known as the Four, they decided that they were going to travel into a mountain range to go looking for a supposed ruins that had some very important religious artifacts inside. If they were allowed to recover these religious artifacts and bring them back to the city that hired them, they would receive a quite handsome payment. However, after arriving at this ruins that turned out to be mostly a buried and ruined temple, they actually found the slowly dying form of that previously mentioned figure, Hestrel. And as they approached and had discussion with this figure of Hestrel, basically Hestrel went and bestowed upon them abilities of its being so that they might combat its enemy, Dentril, that arrived with it onto the plane. Immediately seeing this, Peluvia did know what he was getting into when he accepted the boon from Hestrel, and he knew what he was getting ready to fight. He was going to be getting ready to fight the thing that killed his mother. And as far as he was concerned, that was at the top of his priorities. Seeing the immediate shift in priority, the rest of his friends were willing to get behind him and also accepted it as well, and took the boons and became almost like ambassadors of Hestrel's power and will against Dentril. After a short discussion, the four decided to visit the mountain of Obor, the location that held the Ark Council, which was the series of representatives that oversaw different kingdoms and came together as a conglomerate against any larger evils, and also held the largest magical knowledge in the known realm. As they had discussion with the Ark Council, they brought up what they had been given in terms of abilities, the discussion that they had had with this entity Hestrel, and what the danger that the entity Dentril posed. The Ark Council agreed to back them in their efforts, as well as the two towers that adorned the north and south boundaries of the known and recorded realm. After a discussion of this, and they exited the actual grounds of the Ark Council, is where the entity Dentril decided to confront the last remaining energy of Hestrel. The entity intended to swarm the mountain and take down the four after just overwhelming odds and isolation. What it didn't count on was the fact that the four had gone to Obor to seek aid. After a very bloody battle in which a lot of the Ark Council's members were killed, in addition to Agni, Therum, and Twilix sustaining injury, Agni being the one of which who would actually survive her injuries, whereas Twilic and Therum would pass away. Peluvia managed to land the last blow that would restrain, not kill, but only restrain the entity of Dentril long enough for the Ark Council to split it into 3 seals. These 3 seals were on the material plane, the Feywild, and the Shadowfell. After the detainment and passing of 2 of the members of the 4, Peluvia and Agni reconvened and sought to seek divine favor to bring back their 2 allies. After bringing back Therum and Twilic through quite extensive encouragement of the gods, Peluvia saw this as an opportunity to start to build up a way so that they could all survive. He would come to call this way Ascendant Planes. Unlike liches, this would not require them to maintain a phylactery. Instead, this would require them to maintain the power of the boon that they held within them as a tether so that they could more easily be brought back by magic. This is important because as Therum would eventually give up his mantle, his ascendant plane, and therefore his tether to being resurrected would also dwindle. As this decision was made by Therum to slowly taper out, Twilic made the decision that he was going to hold on to his boon as a sort of advantage over the others of the realm. That basically he was going to use the boon to gather wealth, to gather power, to gather followers, and eventually would have to be stopped by Peluvia and Agni with assistance from a group of very powerful members and also the Ark Council and their 2 towers. However, as the battle ensued and Twilic was mainly brought to a point of submission, is where the Ark Council took its toll. The Ark Council had become split between its north and south towers, being referred to eventually by the wizards and necromancers because one of them, the northern tower, would come to accept necromancy as a suitable part of magic, while the southern tower would come to exile it and even boycott it in many cases. As the council began to split, some very key members, one of them being named Aromus, uh, would actually split the council, killing the uh, previous leader of the Ark Council and severing its ties completely. As the Ark Council fell, so too did the jurisdiction of many of the nations that held it together. And so many of the nations actually devolved into small skirmishes over land and things of that sort. With everything being thrown into chaos and Twi'lek now being sealed away to his own tether of his ascendant plane, Peluvian Agni took this time to, instead of actually walking forward and taking the mantle of responsibility and saying, this is how the world should be brought back and bring it back under the council, they instead decided to take a back seat and let the rest of the world decide what they would do. In doing so, Peluvian Agni were thought dead, as well as Therum, Therum, who had begun to fade away, and Twi'lek, who had been sealed away, were all thought dead for a very long time. And it wasn't until much, much later, right around 1300 years later, and well, you might be asking, how are they still alive? That is actually due to the tethers that they maintained. It caused their lives to be almost halted by aging, something that would eventually become known as a very negative thing to Peluvia. But again, that is another episode's topic completely. So as the four now were left as one fading, two in hiding, and one sealed away, and the world began to move into its new age, it would face a challenge known as the return of Dentril, as the seals that once held Dentril at bay began to slowly weaken. It wasn't until these seals weakened to the point of breaking by assistance of some very naive peoples of the world that Peluvia and Agni would actually make their reappearance. Once Dentril was released, and then the fragment of it that was released was then slain after a very large amount of devastation, one that would actually still stain the material plane up until the current timeline and everything that has happened, and leave the entire continent of Terminus in utter turmoil and darkness. The two seals in the Feywild and Shadowfell also began to draw the attention of some rather ignorant peoples of the material plane. As the two, now only two members, as Therum had now passed away from aging, as his tether had completely faded, as the now two members, Peluvia and Agni, were left over, the other two seals were opened. These two seals then bled over into some of the other outer planes, and while Agni saw this as an opportunity for her to fake her own death and fade completely into hiding, Pluvia saw this as an opportunity for the world to finally see that there was only one way that they could exist, and that was under a returning Ark Council. Pluvia assisted with most of the other Archmages that he could gather at the time to deal with the two sides of Dentril's release. After these two sides were dealt with, Peluvia was actually killed by some of these other mages and allies that he had recovered, and while they did not know of his tether, he was able to also fade into hiding, with Agni doing the same. As they both faded into hiding for a while, the world would eventually need them again, and they would come out of hiding and actually proclaim that they would become the leaders of Pluvia becoming the leader of an arcane institution, and Agni becoming the leader of a outside organization. And when I say outside, I mean outside of the jurisdiction of any of the governments. Uh, an outside organization that focused mainly on maintaining the operation of many of the arcane artifacts and ruins that had been left on the plane. As these two members sort of built up their reputation, we actually come into the current timeline mainly, which is where once all of this had happened and they had become their current positions, uh, other parts of the realm began to slowly deteriorate uh, as some of the titans began to come back from their seals as they began to release after the 3,000 years that they had been put away, and the gods slowly turned their eye back to the material plane as the titans became more and more of an issue. So, in summary, the four started as a simple beginning, and then after meeting over rather simple squabbles and interest and curiosity, they slowly gained reputation through their abilities and gifts that Hestrel had gave them. Uh, After they built all of this, they actually slowly became enemies of many of the states, and that's why they went into hiding. And that feeling of them being the enemy would only fade away as they took roles that firmly stated what their jurisdiction was, what their operating purpose was in life. Uh, and only then would people view them as a necessary part of the world and not an enemy. And that brings us to the current time. So that is what the four are. That is how they came to be, and those are the ones who are still alive. Uh, that is all the lore. I hope you all enjoy listening to this small talk. Because this is the first episode, I don't have very many frequently asked questions to cover this time, so the discussion aspect will have to wait until another time. So, hope you all have a wonderful day, and hope you learned something today.